I want to talk today about the experience of being in a big room and of being in an integrated project delivery process, but from the perspective of a designer. And today, I want to talk about first a shared understanding of what Lean IPD is, and in this case, an integrated project delivery team that is bound together by a relational contract and dedicated to using Lean principles to accomplish the work. So perhaps that can be our working definition, at least for the next 45 minutes here. And with that is also a shared definition of what design would mean today. I'm not a fancy architect. I'm very simple in my approach to both architecture and to design. And so when I say design, I don't mean the cover of a magazine. I mean activities performed by architects, engineers, and construction detailers as they describe a building for construction. One of the first things that will strike someone when they join an integrated project or when they work in a big room for the first time is how alien the environment can be. And what we find most often is that this only goes away when people stop thinking about the company that they work for and embrace this new organization that has been assembled for the purpose of designing and constructing a building. So the way to get around that is to think about the big room and to think about the integrated project as its own organization. And in the way that you would set up your own organization, you have to think about how we will work together, how people will treat each other. How do you behave? Some offices are boisterous and rowdy. Other offices are like sitting in a library. And those people all come together at the same time and are expected to produce something under tremendous pressure and to perform successfully. So it asks for a lot. So this can be very challenging, very much so. And it really is, as I noted here, it's easy to overlook things like coffee. You have something that you take for granted, a refrigerator with drinks and snacks, and then you go to work in this new environment and it isn't there for you. And that's part of your routine. That's how you get your work done effectively. So it's very important to have that consideration be made and to talk about things that if you went to a regular project, a typical project, you would never discuss. It's also important to reserve time for social activities, birthday celebrations, things that celebrate the human side of the people that you've assembled together. Because ultimately, the great resource of bringing people together is the mind, the intellect, the talents, and the ability of the people of that team. And to leverage that, you have to provide for them an environment in which they can flourish and thrive. So as an example, there's a tradition in the United States with an organization called Scouting, Cub Scouts, of building pinewood derby cars that are little blocks of pine wood that you shape into a car, and then you race them. And one of the architects thought it would be a fun idea for our team to participate in a pinewood derby race. And so we made a big event, and we brought in dinner for the team, and we raced the cars, and we listened to music. We had a band that came in and played for us. And it's that type of activity that causes people to build social relationships that then translate into work relationships to help them work together more effectively. Underpinning all activity is technology within a big room, especially with the idea of being able to share files and to work on others' models, BIM models. If this isn't given its proper consideration, it will cause nothing but trouble. It's difficult enough when it works properly, so that when it does work improperly, the entire team can grind to a halt. So some of the key aspects to preserve would be a central location. Michael mentioned using the box site, which is basically storing files in the cloud, and then people pull down information as they need it. When you're in a BIM-rich environment where everyone is modeling and everyone relies on the information of others for coordination and for locating their materials within the model, it's key that people know where to go for the most current version of the work of others. So what we find here is that it's important to develop that central location and then to have a rigorous schedule of posting information to that centralized location. The worst thing is for someone to work for days or even weeks in their own little silo, hiding their work from others, and then to post it all in one big glorious mistake. Because at that point, others will have worked on separately, and now everyone has to engage in rework, having to fix the work that they've already done to match the work of someone who didn't share their work on a regular basis. Within this are a number of challenges having to do with security, with the way that people use software, the way that people tend to work within their own organization versus the new organization of the integrated team. And with that comes the difficult challenge of integrating all of these IT infrastructures so that the work can even commence. The two graphics that I show here are two iterations of the IT relationship that we developed for a project of mine in San Francisco. On the top was the first proposal, which though you can't read it, you can visually understand that it's very complicated. And a lot of arrows and a lot of moving around of flow of parts. And below is the solution that we ultimately came to, where we had one central server that everyone could access. All the shared files lived there, and people could move information around quite easily without threatening their own individual infrastructure setup. One other thing I would note too is that the person who is probably the most important to the success of the team is the on-site technical support, not only for the infrastructure of equipment, the network, the printers, etc., but also the person or persons who manage the interface of the building models. Those folks are on demand at every minute of time that's spent together. And that money is well spent. It's also quite important to have rules for how models will be pulled together, whether people will simply import a copy or whether they will live link, what manner in which they intend to work should then inform the policy that is used for the team as a whole. And it is also important that there be a reliable schedule, usually weekly, sometimes twice per week, of posting new work so that others can benefit by that. Communication is also very critical within the big room and an integrated project setting. You heard Michael say earlier that it was very important to have people be able to talk one-on-one. And while I completely endorse that, I would also add that it is very important to have a very strict plan of communication for the team as a whole. An integrated project team can have more than 100 participants, and not all of them may sit together in the big room. You could have maybe 30 or 40 people that are together every day, and then those remaining 60 or 70 would come in at various points to meetings when their presence is required. And it's also difficult to know when someone will be needed, because the definition of need is based on the value of the stakeholder in that process. So if I'm having a meeting to discuss a plaza outside of a building, it's easy for me to know that I want my civil engineer and my landscape architect, and that I also would like to have the owner present and the building manager present. What I might not think of easily is that because I have a large glass facade and a large indoor area, that I might also want to include my interior designer so that the inside and the outside can have a seamless connection. And in the integrated project, it can be difficult to remember all of the people that you want to have as stakeholders in a meeting if they're not sitting in that particular room on that particular day. So because of that, we work to be very deliberate about preparing agendas for meetings and broadcasting those to the entire team so that everyone has an opportunity to read through the agenda and say, okay, I see that that is being discussed. That's important to me. I need to show up on that day. And we empower everyone on the team to be able to do that. If you're not invited to a meeting, but you think that meeting matters, and you have something to contribute to that meeting, then you should come. And people are willing to do that. That also goes with the work process after the meetings themselves. Through that, we want to work to develop a careful set of commitments that were made during the meeting. Who is going to do what, for whom, when will they do it, what will they produce, and when will they produce it. And along with that, a solid set of minutes that describe the proceedings of the meeting. With that, others outside of the immediate group, again, have the opportunity to read and understand what has gone on, and then to contribute at will should they need to do so. It was a challenge for us on my current project in San Francisco to do this in a consistent manner. It's very easy when we're all sitting together to forget that there's a world outside of the walls of the big room. And with that, we kept missing communication. In this case with our landscape architect, for instance, because he didn't sit with us in the room. He had a very small scope on the project, and we kept missing him. We kept forgetting to notify him. We kept forgetting to get him minutes, or worse yet, we didn't take minutes because we assumed that everyone was already sitting in the room. And that put us in a position where he fell behind on some things, not through his own fault, but because we didn't provide him with the information he needed to be successful. With that comes a need to document decisions. This is an example of an A3, which is a document, or more accurately, a document format that was developed at Toyota. The name A3 is the size of the paper, and it's an A3 because an A3 is the biggest that will fit through a fax machine. So that's why it's an A3. With this is called a 5-box A3, which simply means that there are 5 standard steps of baseline analysis, advantages, proposal, and action plan. There are 7-box A3s. There are 13-box A3s. The point is not the number of boxes. It is a rational, standardized method of describing an issue, proposing action for it, and then describing the next steps that will be taken. So this has been a tool that's very important from a client perspective, not just for the current project itself, but for future projects. It's a way from a program management perspective of taking information, hard-won information on a project and being able to carry it forward on subsequent projects. So this is a tool I would greatly endorse. Another very important aspect of the big room and of the IPD team is the planning of work. If you think about the IPD process from the perspective of cost, you could spend thousands of dollars an hour in terms of the salaries of the people who are sitting there. And if they aren't being effective, or if they're not working in a direction that adds value to the project, it's like watching or ice melt into water. Because the cost of all those people being together is very high. And so with that comes an obligation for that team to plan their work and then to execute it in an effective manner. Personally, from now 10 years of experience, I've seen many tools for planning work, and I've seen many processes, but the one that I come back to that I believe the most in is a manual method using the sticky notes that Michael described earlier. The reason I believe this to be the superior method is because each person is able to contribute physically within the exercise. Each person has their own color and their own sticky notes and their own pen, and they can write their activities, and they can walk up to the board and place their sticky and negotiate with everyone else who's there directly and talk to them and really understand what they need to give to others to complete their work, and to be very clear in saying what they need from others to complete their own work. At that point, I think it's perfectly acceptable to take that manual process embodied in the sticky notes and to translate it into a tool, a technical tool, that links those activities through logic with predecessors and successors. But to me, the key piece, first off, is to have that planning session in person where everyone can interact one-on-one and really work through what is needed to accomplish the work at hand. The thing, too, that I struggle with probably the most when it comes to work planning within my own firm and with the teams that I work with is to take the idea of a plan and to help people to see it as an action. Something that you do not once, not twice, but many times, over and over and over and over again until the project is complete. People want to work hard and produce a plan and then leave the plan as it is and work. And what they fail to understand is that plan is not acceptable. Planning is acceptable. You have to refresh the plan every day because every minute that goes by introduces new information that changes the plan. So the plan must evolve and the plan must adapt, and the plan on one day will be different from the day before. And people also tend to think of planning as a separate activity from working. They want to go back to their desk and get into their computer and design something or model something or detail something. And while there is always a time for that, I struggle to teach people that planning is their work. There's a saying that if someone was given 6 minutes to cut down a tree with an axe, they would spend the first 2 minutes sharpening the axe. How many of us would just start swinging as hard as we could to cut that tree? But it's more important to have the sharp axe and be ready to go, and then to implement the plan and rapidly and effectively execute it. So to accomplish that on a longer cycle project, we need to have a planning cycle that allows you to come together as a team and to refresh the plan. And with that comes a need to also measure and to monitor the performance of the team. Michael mentioned using Last Planner. It was developed by Dr. Ballard and Greg Howell and Lori Koskela. The idea with Last Planner is that you measure how reliable you are in your commitments. And you measure how effective you are at planning work and then actually doing the plan. And so a tool like that, a method like that, is key to implement because it keeps the team refreshing the plan and it gives you something as a baseline to measure against. And with Last Planner, it also happens to be very effective because it ties the daily work all the way up to the key milestone deliverables. So that you aren't just working from week to week, but you always have that end objective in mind, whether it's submitting documents or closing in the building or delivering the furniture or whatever it may be. Target value design is another incredible tool for providing an effective project outcome. In a simple explanation, target value design takes cost and gives it to the designer and the engineer so that when they design, they aren't simply working in a vacuum, but actually have data about what their decisions will end up costing the project. That's a big change for the way most architects have worked traditionally. And while most of us as architects have a rough idea that one material may cost more than another, or that one process, because it's more complicated, will be less cost effective because it takes more labor to install, we don't really have a dollar or euro sense of how much something actually costs to put in place. And it's only once we have that cost information that we can answer the value proposition that has been put forth in the criteria from the owner. Because it'd be nice to provide everything the owner asks for in the way that we want to, but it's very unlikely that those solutions can fit within the project budget. So within that, when the contractor provides cost information, the estimate really should tie into the building information model. And with that, I mean not just that there's a building information model, a BIM model that the contractor can look at, but that you design with components within the model that can be used for detailed takeoffs. If you have 150 chairs, then it should link to the estimate with the cost of 150 chairs, or 200 fire smoke dampers, or 300 square meters of carpet, or whatever it may be. So the idea then is not only for the contractor to be able to pull that information in a logical way, but for the architect and the engineer to use to design in a way that enables the estimating to take place. In the IPD setting, I would say on my current project in San Francisco, more than half of the drawings are produced by construction detailers. Our mechanical system is being drawn by the detailers who will then fabricate that mechanical system and put that ductwork and plumbing in place within the building itself. Most of those people who are construction detailers are in their 40s or 50s and have, before that, 10 to 15 to 20 years of experience in the field, installing the things that we as designers have drawn. You can imagine they have some opinions about how to better draw things so that they can actually install them. And the thing that enables us to do that's very powerful here is that we can leverage their real world experience to better inform our drawings. We have something, the way that we categorize drawings or the activity of work is something called means and methods that the contractor uses. And for them, it represents not just the way that they put work in place, but the way that they have figured out to do so efficiently. For them, it often represents a competitive advantage. And so we, as a design team, need to learn to use that to help prepare documents that show the means and methods that the contractor will employ to put the work in place. So we'll come into that a little bit more lately, or a little later in the presentation. But that's also a piece of target value design, in that as these changes are made, the detailers are able to provide information back to their office to update the estimate, and that the estimate then is refreshed for the team. And it should occur no less frequently than every 2 weeks, so that we're always working with current cost information and thereby ensuring the value for the owner. So I jumped the gun on this a little bit. The idea of the builder as subject matter expert. I've been practicing architecture for nearly 20 years, and I learned as much as I possibly could about how to frame walls using metal studs. It's something I'm interested in. I've always liked it. I love drawing the details. I spent about an hour with a gentleman named Roger, who had worked in the field for 30 years as a framer. And it was clear to me he had forgotten more about framing than I would ever know. So I think the thing that architects and designers must learn when they're working with these craftspersons from the field is that they have a phenomenal wealth of knowledge about how to put buildings together. This is an example of, this isn't a detail per se that we simply drew. This is actually a live cut of our BIM model. We have, let's see, if you can see my little red dot here, the structural model that came from our steel fabricator, and then we ourselves drew the partitions, but we only drew the gypsum wallboard on the exterior. The trade partner, the framer, went in and on our project is placing every single metal stud, not just in a random manner, but in the way that they intend to build it in the field. And so what we actually did was to give them control of our partitions early on in the design process, so that they could move the walls around and substitute different studs and wall thicknesses, etc., and be able to design each of these details in the way that they would build it. Normally, I would draw a column detail, in this case with the rated partition that comes into it, in a generic way, and I would submit that to the reviewing agency so they could permit that particular detail. And it would go, and then it would mean absolutely nothing to the person in the field who was going to build it. They would completely alter the way that it would be put together, and it would pass inspection, but it would have unintended consequences on the layout of the room, for instance. Because with the column, if I design it tight against the column, and then it moves further into the room, then it's going to cause problems with my room layout. So the way to get around that for our team is for the people to be part of the process from the very beginning. So their means and methods are part of the way that we draw and describe the building. With this, in some ways, architects struggle because it's taking away something that we normally do and that we probably thought we were good at doing. As it turns out, we were not. But we still have a very important role of coordinating these trades as they come together to work. And a great way to do these, or do this effort, is to work in a detailing workshop. To take the columns, the skin of the building, areas where a number of trades come together and where you have critical details. You don't want water to penetrate the building. You need a rating to make its way successfully through a floor plan. And to really work together to develop how those pieces will actually be assembled in the field and to successfully meet the design intent. As our British friends would say, mind the gap, where one trade scope ends and another scope begins. Because trade contractors are very good at their own scope, but they're not as good at each other's. And when you have many different trades working in one area, you have to be very, very careful about how all of those pieces will come together. And that's a place where the architect can add more value in the new process by being mindful of that. In this case, we were responsible for drawing these little areas here where we had mineral wool and fire spray. A small thing, but the rating doesn't work without either of those items. This has proven to be the biggest challenge on our project. The distinction between design and detailing was one that I personally did not give enough respect to when we began the project. The detailers work in a very specific way to produce shop drawings to be able to install a particular scope of work. They will detail down to the level of pipe fittings, of conduit fittings, boxes, all kinds of very detailed things that accurately reflect exactly what will be put in place in the field. It's very difficult for design and detailing to occur at the same time. A small move for me, shifting a wall, maybe half a meter to one side, is potentially disastrous for the detailing effort that has gone on in that area, because it may shift the partition so that it now aligns with a beam, or it aligns with a sprinkler main line, or it now runs into a zone valve box or something like that. And so one lesson that we learned was that we needed to finish moving around doors and windows and walls before we released work on a particular floor for detailing. I was also of the opinion at one point that if I think of the project as a whole, wouldn't it be more efficient to simply pay the detailers to keep changing their work? And yet, I've come to believe that that's also perhaps not the best way to go. Not because of the money, but because of the impact on them as workers. To draw something and then to have to discard most of it, and then to draw it again and then have to discard a portion of that again, is psychologically very difficult at times. And it's something that, again, is going back to that first slide, an idea that has to do with the way that you treat the people who work in the big room together. Another ingredient for success within an integrated project team and within a big room is the idea of shared business interests. The key word here is transparency. When you work in an IPD team, at least in the ones that I've worked in, everything that you do from a business perspective is transparent to the rest of the team. The number of people that you propose to bring to the project, how much they get paid, how long they're going to work on the project, what activities they're going to do, and with that, kind of higher level measures of how much you will spend each month to accomplish the work through the lifetime of the project. There have been a number of IFOA projects, and IFOA stands for Integrated Form of Agreement, which is a contracting method that's used by my client. There are a number of IFOA projects that started very, very well and went along nearly to the end and then suddenly ran out of money. And nobody saw it coming. No one had any idea that the project was unhealthy when everything seemed to be going so well. So one of the things that is now very important to do is to do what we call financial forecasting, or monthly financial forecasting. The gray graph underneath shows my monthly spend, the dollars that I'll spend each month for my team to be part of the integrated project. Within each of those columns are 3 bars: my original plan, my actual plan, and then my reforecasted plan. It's not enough to simply track how much we have spent. We also have to work each month to understand how much we will spend. It's the same as the planning exercise. It's not enough to make a plan. You have to continue planning and evolving. Within that, we also have a weekly risk and opportunity meeting where we bring issues forward and discuss amongst the financial stakeholders of the team items that we believe are going to cost the project money and opportunities for the project to save money. And those are always at the forefront so that we always know how much impact there potentially is. And the reason for this is that we have been given an incentive that we will receive no profit unless the project comes in at or under budget. And so, since all of us would like to make profit on the project, we all come together and not only are concerned about our profit, but the profit of all of our team members. And it produces a spirit of collaboration and of a level of interest in helping the others around you to succeed, which I think is key to success. Building the right team is a challenge. And I will tell you that, as in any activity, not everyone is as good at being in the big room as others. Some people just don't find that a pleasant or pleasing way to work. With that, I've had some observations that someone who is technically experienced, who in most design firms would be given a position of supervision or management where they direct the work of others, may not be the best person to lead in the big room. Because leading in the big room isn't about knowing everything there is to know. It's about hearing everything and then working together to develop consensus on how to move forward. And someone who's always been very authoritarian about, well, this is what I think and this is what we're going to do, will probably struggle when they have to consider the viewpoints of all these other people who are not just architects, but engineers and detailers, designers from other professions. I would say that someone who is confident in what they say and yet humble enough to throw out an idea and have it rejected and not need their best idea to carry forward, I think that person will do well in the big room. It's okay to have your idea challenged when you're confident, because you don't have to always have your idea chosen. And it's the person who is willing to listen to the best idea for the team and not just their own idea that will perform well in the big room. I would also say that curiosity is incredibly important to have. When you think about it, you're placed in a big room with 20, 25, even 30 different disciplines ranging across the design and construction industry. Projects that use IPD tend to be more complicated. And so because of that, you have a tremendous opportunity as a professional to go and to learn, to ask your neighbor or ask somebody from a discipline that you don't interact with, how do they do their job? What are they interested in? What matters to them on the building? And so someone who is curious will thrive in that environment. They'll wake up every day and they'll be excited to come to work because there's so much to learn. I would also say that a spirit of innovation is very important. Someone who comes to the first solution and says, okay, we're good, we're done. It's probably not the way to approach things. Someone who keeps digging for a little bit more, find a little more value, eliminate a little more waste, and find creative ways of doing it. Try to think like the plumber if you're an architect. Try to think like the steel erector if you hang drywall. That type of person who is willing to be innovative and to try to put themselves into the shoes of others will likely be very successful as well. I would also note that younger professionals tend to do very well in the big room as well. This is Kayla. She works on my team. She's 24 years old, and she came in with about 4 months of experience working at our firm before she started working in the big room. Within a few weeks, it was clear that she needed to be in charge of the exterior team. Not because she had any great knowledge about GFRC, like Michael was describing, glass fiber reinforced panels, concrete panels, or because of some great knowledge of window systems, but because she understood how to bring the group together. We had 6 or 7 different trades in the exterior team working together, and she was the one who was able to quickly understand how to bring the team together and move them forward. Who would have thought, right? And yet within that integrated project environment, within that big room, because it's a very flat organization, someone with almost no experience at all, but with the right skills as a person, was able to be very successful and add great value to the team. So with that, I thank you. I hope, did I spell it right? Is that right? Excellent.
So thank you, Romano. And again, looking around, are there any questions ready? In fact, can I start questioning you?
Yes, please.
On one of the slides at the very top there, the first sentence was that all the partners in the big room, they have to sign the contract, for IPD contract. And when I refer back to Michael's story that all the contracts, they are prepared by the lawyers, but IPD is a field, just a rather new field. Do you think, are the lawyers at home with IPD system and IPD contracts, or does somebody help or advise, well, what is IPD? Because traditionally lawyers, they want to use the traditional tools.
In my experience, there are a small number, fewer than 5 lawyers that I would say have strong expertise in this type of relational contracting in the United States. One of the things that you probably would observe is that there are projects, IPD projects across the country, and 1 or 2 lawyers that have helped author the contracts for them. So I would say that it is a rarefied practice, although I would ask Michael to comment. He is probably more in tune with this than I am, but that's my sense. Would you agree? I would agree. Okay.
Any more comments rather than you agree?
I think that this is an area where if the lawyers can get the basic form, the basic structure of an IPD contract correct, then the team members' agreements on how to proceed can be done without lawyers involved, and that's a good thing. So a lot of law practices aren't interested in this because it means very little work for them. And again, I think that's a good thing. And the reason I say it's a good thing is not because it's a sort of anti-lawyer joke, but because our legal system is very expensive. And the outcomes, once a project is subject to lawsuits and litigation, are very uncertain. And so for people who are trying to do things in the world, to get a project mixed up in litigation is a kind of disaster because the outcomes are unpredictable and very costly, no matter what you do. So that's why I try to avoid it.
I think you can safely say that once it goes to litigation, literally nobody will win.
Do you want some more questions? Well, I see.
I have a more technical question. At the beginning, you mentioned those tools you used to support the collaboration, like ProjectWise and Passo. Mm-hmm. Just a few hints. What's your opinion on that, and what would you recommend?
I think it depends on the personality of the owner and on the personality of the team. I've done both. I've done a number. I've done a server that was paid for by the team, and then everyone worked out a way to connect to it. I've done ProjectWise, which is centralized, cloud-based document management, although they do have difficulty interfacing with BIM models, so there's still work to be done to get Revit, for instance, to interface properly with ProjectWise. And then I've also used Box, although that was largely for document correspondence, not for the models themselves. And then we also use Newforma, which is basically a database that hosts email that allows you to process change orders and RFIs, etc. I would say that they all have strengths and weaknesses. I would say that I would try something like Box, which you could probably use for free, just in terms of the size of data as a starting point if you haven't tried one before, because ProjectWise costs a lot of money to implement, as do the other solutions. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Romano, for the interesting presentation. I think your presentation actually raised a couple of, I dare to say, fundamental questions. And one of these was the process of validation. And it seemed to be the logical part of the design process and the planning process in general, as in essence, the design and the planning is a prediction about the future in terms of meeting our objectives. So you only mentioned the validation against the cost, but was there some kind of design quality management processes in place for validating against the other design performance criteria?
Mm-hmm. As a contrast to the way that Michael developed a system, he works for a public institution and therefore has more constraints than my clients typically have. What I see them currently doing, though, is of a similar mentality of seeking to develop design criteria before the project even goes to the finance board for approval. And so my project in San Francisco, for instance, we spent, I think, 5 or 6 months with a pretty large integrated team developing a validation study. With that came a schematic estimate, a schematic program, test fits, with a hospital, you do floor plans and vertical sections to show how the departments all work together, and a pro forma provided by the owner to show that they could afford to operate and pay back the bonds that would finance the construction of that particular hospital. So we probably spent, probably $2 million, I think, against what ultimately became a $500 million project to come up with this validation study. And with that also came narratives for all of the building systems, structural, mechanical, security, medical equipment. And all of that information was compiled together, and that schematic estimate was then used to go for funding approval with the owner. So I would say that that type of method of developing sound criteria, developing the budget for it, and then challenging the team to use those criteria to deliver the project, I think is the sound manner in which things will progress in the future.
Very good, thank you. Because I don't want to send maybe a wrong message to the audience, so I'm asking if you agree with me on the aspect that the IPD itself is not the magical pill for all the problems, but it's rather the IPD is for establishing the environment where now the people can start to work together, develop processes first together, and then design better value for the client and end users.
I agree completely. The IPD arrangement is a response to a desire on the part of the owner to create an environment where teams will collaborate successfully, and they will innovate, and they will ultimately deliver the project at lower cost, but with higher value. It is a way of organizing around a large project. It requires some modification for a small project, but the ideas of value and of reducing waste and of collaboration are more personal things that people should learn that will make them successful on any project, whether it's an IPD project or not. And I would say that even more removed from that, any kind of relational contract is never going to successfully force people to behave in a way that they're not willing to behave. It can remove barriers, but people themselves have to accept a willingness to collaborate, a willingness to take on the responsibilities of all and take ownership of that. And a contract isn't going to necessarily tell them to do that. They have to come to that themselves.
Hello, Romano.
Hello.
You said that sometimes you have to update your plan. For example, today is not what was yesterday, for example. And does it mean that the duration of the project is not the same? That you have to prolong the designing, for example, or does it mean that? So how to estimate the correct dates at the first place? So.
You've hit on one of the most challenging things to do. The way that I think of it is that we work very hard at the beginning. Those who have more experience are brought to the table to help define the outlines, the boundaries of the project. And at the very beginning, you would develop a master schedule for the project that has perhaps 10 milestones. And those are educated guesses. And at the same time, there also may be periods where the owner will say, I have to see a patient by this particular day to qualify for this amount of funding from the government. And at that point, you would look at that date, and then everyone would plan in such a way, considering the amount of money that would then become available because of that government grant. and plan the work in such a way as to achieve that particular milestone. So it becomes, it really is a push and pull through the first third and sometimes even the first half of the project. And it can be made more difficult by not knowing what the owner's expectations are. And it's still difficult, even if the owner is very clear about what they want, to plan all the work to fit in with a particular sequence. But what typically does happen is that a milestone will be set, and then the activity is to replan to meet the milestone over and over and over again. And that can be a very difficult thing to do when you're further out from the milestone, because it's hard to know if you are early or late. And there are some software tools that will tell you that, but it comes down to the level of planning that's been put in. What ends up really happening is that over the course of the project, the plan feels very loose, and then it will feel tight, and then something will happen that makes it diverge, and then it will tighten back up, and it just kind of oscillates in that manner. And then as you get closer, there's a point toward closer to the milestone where it suddenly seems to lock in. And that's when people it gets within what they can understand in their head, and then they just hit the ground and run as hard as they can to get it finished. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but it just seems to be all over the place, and then it works out.
Okay, thank you, Romano. And now really we have no more time for questions. And normally in construction, even in IPD, I think there are overtime allowed. We have some 7-8 minutes already coming into our lunchtime, and you have to consume the food very innovatively, very quickly to be back here at 2 o'clock. Anyhow, let's thank Romano for this.
Thank you.